Hello everyone, I am delighted to welcome you to our final session on Anita Desai in custody. In our previous discussion, we explored chapter 8 and 9, where Devan struggles with the recording process intensify and his illusions about Noor begin to unravel. We also closely examined the growing disillusionment, the chaotic environment at Noor's house and the symbolic tension between poetry and practicality. These chapters set the stage for Devan's emotional and professional crisis. Today, we will dive into the final chapters of the novel, tracing Devan's quiet transformation and reflecting on the novel's broader thematic and symbolic significance. Dear students, now let us turn on to chapter 10, where the consequences of Devan's failed recording project begin to unfold. To begin with, the chapter opens with Devan arriving at the Pink House, expecting to continue recording Noor's poetry. However, to his shock, Noor and everyone else have already left without informing him. At this point, Chiku, his assistant, expresses his frustration, saying they have wasted yet another day. Shortly after, a tall woman from an earlier visit yells at them from a window, annoyed that they have written after being told not to. As if to confirm their unwelcome status, a bouncer appears and tells them to leave. Before they go, he mentions that the bill have been forwarded to Safia Begum and they must ensure it is paid. Following this, Devan and Murad meet at Jane's shop to listen to the recordings. Since Devan must return to Mirpur soon to complete his grading work, he insists they go through the tapes immediately. Unfortunately, as they begin listening, it becomes clear that the entire project has turned into a disaster. The tapes are poorly recorded, filled with background noise and mostly unusable. Understandably, Murad becomes furious and asks why Devan didn't check the recordings while they were being made. Devan, humiliated and defeated, has no answer, only a weak promise to salvage what he can. As the conversation continues, Murad begins blaming both Devan and Jane for using substandard equipment and not renting a professional studio. Eventually, he throws the tapes back at Devan, instructing him to do whatever he can with them. This moment triggers a rare outburst from Devan, who lashes out at Jane over the equipment and Chiku's incompetence. Interestingly, instead of reacting defensively, Jane is impressed by Devan's passion and offers to send his nephew Pintu to help sort things out. Subsequently, Devan and Pintu return to Mirpur. Upon arrival, Devan finds his home in a state of disorder. His wife Sarla is still away and the house is filthy. He reflects that the neglected house is a mirror of his broken marriage. The very next day, he receives a letter from Noor asking the college to fund his eye treatment. Over the following weeks, Devan tries to catch up with his academic responsibilities while restoring together the broken recordings. Pintu helps him and eventually one of Devan's students, Dhanu, volunteers to assist. Dhanu even brings a few friends to rejoin the effort. Meanwhile, Siddiq, Devan's colleague, gradually withdraws from the project. In spite of everyone's efforts, the end result is deeply disappointing. The final tape is clumsy patchwork of fragments lacking scholarly or artistic value. When Siddiq listens to the final product, he quietly asks if that is all. Devan replies, that is all, but adds that he is working on a monograph. Afterward, Pintu asked him to be paid for his time and travel. The student helpers also expect good grades in return. Offended by this, Devan refuses and sends them away, though they leave angrily. Shortly after, another letter arrives from Noor, this time demanding that his son receives free education from Devan's college. By this time, Devan is emotionally exhausted and longs for a quite uneventful existence. Later on, at college, Devan chats with a colleague named Jaydev who laments their poor career choices. Jaydev argues that choosing literature over science and technology has left them with no future. Devan disagrees, saying that all they have is the past. Irritated, Jaydev walks away. Eventually, Devan finds yet another letter, this one containing a bill for the pink house. When he takes it to Murad, Murad explodes, saying he already paid for everything and won't give another paisa. In the final scene, Devan walks into the blistering Delhi heat, exhausted and defeated. Murad tries to buy the rights to the tape, but Devan refuses, saying it belongs to the college. As he wanders in a dusty park, he reflects on the complicated nature of poetry and art. Though not as straightforward as science, perhaps that is what gives them meaning. Picking up from where we left off, chapter 11 opened with Devan realizing that Noor has disappeared, and what follows is a steady unraveling of both the recording project and Devan's fragile hopes. To begin with, Devan returns home and finds Sarla back from her parents' house. As usual, she is distant and unkind, but this time Devan no longer feels hurt by her coldness. Instead of arguing, he chooses to stay emotionally distant, not wanting to appear weak in his own home. When he asks about their son Manu, Sarla mentions that her parents bought the boy new clothes and shoes. Although her words sting, Devan accepts them quietly. Surprisingly, although Sarla doesn't express joy, she seems content to be back in her familiar space. In a rare gesture, she even offers to make him some tea. Soon after, Devan notices another letter from Delhi. At first, he assumes it must be from Noor, but to his surprise, it is from Imtiaz Begum. In the letter, Imtiaz writes with anger, saying she knows about the recordings and feels insulted that Devan tried to exclude her. She insists that she is not a mere entertainer or a dancing girl, but a real poet. She encloses some of her poems and demands Devan read them seriously. Since she is a woman, she says she has always lacked access to education or support, but even Noor recognized her talent. She challenges Devan to be brave enough to judge her work with honesty and fairness. At this moment, a deep sense of helplessness consumes Devan. He has always ignored Imtiaz, pretending she was not a part of literary world he admired. Now, faced with her confident voice and demand for recognition, he feels deeply shaken. He realizes that reading her poetry might ruin the illusions he has clung to, just like a madman might be destroyed by a sudden moment of clarity. The following day, Devan goes to college to try and speak to principal before the upcoming board meeting. He hopes to explain his side of the story. However, the registrar informs him that the principal is busy and Devan is forced to leave in disappointment. He realizes with the growing dread that Noor's letters often demanding money or help will never stop. Later, he stops by Siddique's house only to discover it is being torn down. Siddiq calmly explains that he sold the land to a developer from Delhi and is happy with the deal. When Devan mentions the board meeting and asks Siddiqui to speak in support of the Urdu project, Siddiq coldly refuses. He tells Devan that he allowed himself to be cheated and should have tried harder to protect himself. In response, Devan murmurs that love for poetry and for Noor should mean something. Just then, a loud crash of bricks plaster interrupts him, a symbol of the collapse of all he once believed in. Soon after, Devan receives yet another letter from Noor, this time asking for money to go on a pilgrimage to Makkah. That night, Devan could not sleep. Restless and anxious, he goes for a walk. A haunting tranquility defines the night. He dreads the morning, knowing it will be the board meeting, possible public humiliation, and maybe even the loss of his job. He worries about Sarla and Manu and even wishes for a moment that something would happen to free him from all responsibility. But deep down, he knows no one is coming to save him. As dawn begins to break, Devan reflects on his long and painful journey. Despite all the humiliation and failure, he knows he cannot walk away from Noor's poetry. He once accepted the poet's words, and that makes him the custodian of Noor's genius. This realization brings both comfort and responsibility. In the end, Devan gathers his strength and prepares to face the day. No matter how difficult it may be, he resolves to meet head on. With the narrative now complete, it's time to explain how Desai uses literary techniques such as imagery, irony, symbolism to deepen our understanding of a language, failure, and identity. Dear students, by the final chapter of In Custody, the failure of Devan's recording project is undeniable. The tapes are unusable and he is overwhelmed with shame, humiliation, and dread. Though Desai omits the actual board meeting, it is clear Devan anticipates harsh judgment, professional humiliation, and perhaps even dismissal. His fears extend beyond himself. He worries about Sarla abandoning him and Manu growing up humiliated by his father's failures. These imagined consequences deepen Devan's sense of helplessness, marking the collapse not just of his dreams but all of his identity as a teacher, husband, father, and failed custodian of the fading tradition. Instead of collapsing, Devan begins to accept his failures and responsibilities. Letting go of fantasies, he realizes no one will rescue him. Growth now lies to facing life as it truly is. Several signs suggest Devan is maturing and gaining clarity. He begins to find unexpected comfort in returning to his ordinary life. Once dismissed as dull, now seen as safe and endurable. After facing chaos and failure, he accepts that this quiet existence may be the only life he was truly meant for, revealing a shift from illusion to acceptance and deeper understanding of his own limitations. Devan's growth is evident in his calm reaction when Murad refuses to pay the studio bill. He no longer expects others to rescue him and accepts personal responsibility. This marks a new mental resilience. Later, when Sarla returns, he feels no irritation or resentment. Though aware of her flaws, he accepts them as a part of his reality, showing he is learning to live with imperfection instead of resisting it. Most importantly, Devan accepts the reality of his relationship with Noor. Once he idolizes Noor as a pure legendary poet. Eventually, he comes to see him as a broken and difficult man. Even so, Devan knows their bond cannot be erased. He feels that he is now the custodian of Noor's genius. In other words, by accepting Noor's poetry, Devan has taken on the duty to protect and carry it forward. This, he understands, is both a burden and an honor. According to Desai, this acceptance gives Devan a new kind of freedom rather than remaining trapped in his disappointments. He now has a purpose to keep Noor's poetry alive. Despite everything, this is a powerful reward. Ultimately, the novel ends with Devan preparing to meet the new day. Instead of hiding from problems, he chooses to run toward them. This decision, though quiet, shows real courage. Thus, In Custody becomes a story of personal growth. At last, Devan is no longer in custody of his fears. He is now the proud custodian, something greater than himself. Poetry, memory and meaning. Dear students, now let us explore the key symbols, allegories and recurring motifs that deepen the meaning of In Custody. Desai skillfully employs symbolism in Custody to highlight Devan's inner turmoil and the disintegration of cultural and personal ideals. To begin with, Noor's staircase symbolizes Devan's imagined rise into the world of poetry and intellectualism. However, this illusion shatters when he finds Noor's living space in disorder, showing the gap between fantasy and reality. In the same way, Devan's recurring nightmare, where he struggles to reach an unknown destination but remains trapped, mirrors his inability to achieve success or purpose in life. Furthermore, the pigeons that attack Noor serves as symbols of exploitation. Their greed reflects the people who feed off the poet's fame without offering respect or support. In addition, the crash of Siddique's house stands for the collapse of Devan's dreams and the fading importance of Urdu. Finally, the motif of omens, dead flies, comets, bad weather reinforces Devan's belief that failure is destined. Together, these elements deepen the novel's themes of loss, illusion and decline. So, dear students, let us examine the figurative language in the novel In Custody to understand how it shapes perception of Devan's inner world and social reality. In Custody, Anita Desai uses metaphor and similes to reflect Devan's inner turmoil and disillusionment. When Devan returns to his classroom as if at a refuge, the simile conveys his anxiety and the classroom's symbolic safety. Murad's metaphor, describing Noor as the star of the issue, sending rays to all the corners of the world, portrays the poet's former brilliance and fading influence. A striking simile likens Delhi's sky to an old hag dancing a dance of 7 veils, suggesting not beauty but unsettling chaos. This figurative devices deepen our understanding of Devan's emotional state and the decaying world he inhabits. Now, let us have a closer examination of In Custody reveals that irony plays a subtle yet powerful role in deepening the novel's themes and character dynamics, which means shifting relationships and connections between the characters and how their interaction, views and motivations change throughout a story. In Custody, Desai uses verbal, situational and dramatic irony to underscore the gap between Devan's dreams and reality. His sarcastic remark on Mirpur's dryness and the idea of reconsoling a legendary poet reflects irony and absurdity. Dramatic irony arises when others believe in his doomed project about his Delhi visits. These moments highlight Devan's illusions, adding humor while emphasizing themes of failure, disillusionment and misplaced devotion. Now, let us dive into the vivid imagery that reflects Devan's despair. Withered landscape, murky skies, a lone tape evoke emotional and artistic decay, mirroring his disillusionment and collapse of his dreams. Now, in Custody, we have Urdu as a language which symbolizes the fading culture and literary heritage, though linguistically close to Hindi. Urdu's distinct Persian Arabic vocabulary and nostalgic script set it apart. For characters like Devan and Noor, the language embodies a once glorious tradition now in decline, highlighting themes of loss, identity and cultural erosion. Let us discuss at the end of In Custody the literary elements by Anita Desai, which deepens its themes of loss and disillusionment. Set in 1980s Delhi and Mirpur, the contrast highlights Devan's inner conflict. The third person omniscient narration centers on his psychological decline, while tone and mood shift from hopeful to claustrophobic. Symbolism, irony and foreshadowing like the failed tapes and omens reflect inevitable failure. Cultural allusions and vivid imagery evoke decay and despair. Metaphor and personification give force. Desai's layered techniques ultimately shape the novel into a poignant meditation on identity, failure and the erosion of cultural heritage. Dear students, let us come to a conclusion. Anita Desai's In Custody in a deeply introspective and multi-layered novel that examines the decline of linguistic and cultural heritage through the personal failures and modest awakenings of its protagonist Devan Sharma. The novel skillfully interweaves the themes of artistic decay, institutional apathy and the emotional cost of misplaced idealism. By the end of the narrative, Devan comes to recognize that his romanticized vision of literature and legacy has little place in the harsh realities of the modern life. Yet, in embracing his role as the custodian of Noor's poetry, however fragmented or flawed, he finds a sense of quiet dignity and purpose. This transformation from disillusionment to reluctant acceptance underscores the novel's final message. Preservation may not always be grand or successful, but even small, sincere efforts toward cultural memory are more meaningful. With this, dear students, I conclude and would like to extend my sincere gratitude to all of you for your kind attention and insightful contribution throughout the discussion. Your engagement has added considerable depth to our collective reading of the novel. As we close, may we reflect on the enduring relevance of Desai's work and the subtle yet profound ways literature holds up a mirror to the personal and societal tension of our time. Thank you.